There are stories so powerful that the wind seems to carry them across the plains for generations. This is one of them. On a winter night, so cruel it could steal the breath from a grown man, a lone cowboy rode through the silence of falling snow, guided only by instinct and the faint echo of something not quite right. He wasn't looking for anything, just returning from checking fence lines, but fate had a way of finding those who walked quietly with a good heart. Beneath the twisted roots of a fallen pine, he heard it. A cry. Small. Fragile. A sound that didn't belong in that cold. And when he dismounted, brushing aside snow like dust on an old saddle, he saw her, an infant, wrapped in animal hide, her cheeks purple from the cold, her eyes open and pleading. He should have turned back. He knew the risks. This land wasn't just his. It pulsed with the spirit of the Apache, and an outsider touching what belonged to them, especially a child, could spark a war faster than a match on dry grass. But the cowboy wasn't made of fear. He was made of something quieter, something harder to name. Without hesitation, he took off his coat, wrapped the baby inside it, and rode for home. That decision, simple as it seemed, would shift the winds of his destiny in a way no man could have predicted. By the time the sun dipped below the canyons, shadows began to move differently. The wind changed. Horses in the valley snorted uneasily, and by nightfall, the cowboy's small ranch, usually silent save for the rustle of prairie grass, was encircled, not by enemies, but by sentinels. Apache warriors, 300 strong, stood guard in complete silence. No fire, no weapons drawn, only presence, eyes sharp as obsidian, watching every inch of the cold night. What message they carried, they did not speak, but the cowboy understood. They had seen what he did. They knew he had not acted out of conquest, but compassion. What none of the townsfolk would believe, even if you swore it under oath, was that the next morning, not a single footprint remained in the snow. The warriors had vanished before dawn like ghosts, leaving behind no trace but the safety they had offered. And the child, she never cried again. She slept in peace, as if she knew she had been guarded not just by blood, but by something even greater, a sacred bond that can't be bought, only earned. It was the kind of honor the West rarely speaks of aloud, but never forgets. In a land where violence often wrote the final word, this story whispered a different truth, one of mercy, trust, and a silent pact between two worlds that history tried to keep apart. And it all began because one man heard a cry in the snow and chose to answer. The cowboy, known almost only as Eli Cutter, wasn't a man used to warmth. Not from people, not from fortune. He'd buried his wife 5 winters before and hadn't spoken more than a few words in town since. The mountains had become his true companions, and solitude his only ally. But holding that child in his arms, he felt something shift deep in his chest, something that felt a lot like the first crack in a frozen river. She was too small to survive the night alone, and too sacred to leave behind. That night, as the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, Eli built a fire, boiled water with trembling hands, and wrapped her in every scrap of cloth he could find. He didn't sleep. He just watched, listened, waited. What Eli didn't know was that a few miles to the east, smoke signals had already gone up. The tribe had discovered the child missing. Her name was Kiona, which meant brown hills in her mother's tongue, and she was the granddaughter of a powerful Apache chief known as Iron Dog. The child's disappearance was not seen as misfortune. It was seen as an act of war. Scouts were sent. Tracks were followed. And when they found the path leading to Eli's cabin, they moved swiftly but silently, like shadows slipping between trees. By the time they arrived, they were ready to kill. But the moment they laid eyes on the scene, Eli asleep against the cabin wall, the baby cradled against his chest, wrapped in his only winter coat, their blades paused mid-air. They didn't see a thief. They saw a protector, a man who had given warmth from his own body, who hadn't tried to run or hide or barter. They saw honor, and in that frozen stillness, something ancient stirred between them. A warrior stepped forward, whispered something only Kiona would understand, and the child smiled in her sleep. That was all the proof they needed. Eli awoke not to the cold, but to the sound of silence, the kind that feels heavy, like a breath before thunder. His eyes met the warriors, and though not a word was spoken, a message passed between them as clearly as if it had been carved in stone. No one moved. No one threatened. It was as if the land itself had brokered a peace. Iron Dog arrived just before sunrise. He looked at Eli with the gaze of a man who had lost everything once before and feared he would again. But when he saw the way his granddaughter rested peacefully, untouched, unafraid, his heart softened like dry bark after rain. Eli handed the child over without resistance, though something in him tore as he did. He didn't ask for thanks, didn't expect mercy. But what came next was something he never imagined. Iron Dog nodded once, and with that, the warriors dismounted, surrounding the cabin not with threat, but with purpose. They formed a living shield around the cowboy's home. All through that night, they stood watch under the stars, honoring the man who had given shelter to what the tribe held most sacred. And just like that, Eli Cutter, once forgotten by the world, was now under the protection of an entire nation. The days that followed were filled with a silence deeper than solitude. No one from town came up the trail to Eli's cabin. Word had spread faster than wildfire that the Apache had taken a liking to the reclusive cowboy, and no one was foolish enough to test what that meant. But Eli didn't bask in the legend that was forming around him. He spent those days mending his fences, gathering firewood, and staring long at the horizon, wondering what it all meant. He'd lived so long as a ghost among men, and now he'd become part of something larger than himself, a myth in the making. One afternoon, a rider approached slowly from the North Ridge, wrapped in a patterned cloak woven with the stories of her people. It was Keona's mother, Sonny. She dismounted not as a stranger, but as someone following the trail of gratitude. She brought with her food, herbs, and a single word, "two." It meant heart. She said little else, but her eyes told the rest. She saw in Eli the kind of man stories often forgot to remember, the quiet kind, the just kind. She left behind more than offerings. She left behind a question in his soul. Was it possible that a man who'd spent years lost in grief could still be worthy of something good? Eli began to change, slowly, not in the way that townspeople might notice, but in the way the earth changes with spring. He started carving wooden toys again, like he used to for his son. He patched the broken window he'd ignored for 3 years. He even sang once, when no one was around to hear. He wasn't trying to become someone new. He was remembering someone he used to be. And all because one tiny life, carried into his world by a storm, had cracked open the shell he'd built to survive. But not everyone saw Eli's connection with the Apache as something noble. Down in Dry Creek, there were men who still believed that any kindness shown to a native was weakness. Sheriff Holt, a man with a mustache thicker than his patience, didn't take kindly to the whispers that a cowboy had been adopted by a tribe. "A man can't ride both sides of a river," he said one evening in the saloon, slamming his glass down hard enough to shake the poker chips. His words carried weight, and soon, so did his actions. A plan began to form, one rooted not in law, but in fear and control. And so, while Eli chopped wood beneath a quiet sun, danger stirred miles away in the form of wagons, rifles, and men with something to prove. They didn't care about the truth of what happened that night. They only cared that the West remained divided the way they understood it, us versus them. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't yet see, was that Eli Cutter was no longer alone. And when a man stands with an entire people behind him, even the deepest snow can melt beneath his fire. The attack wasn't loud. It came like a snake in the grass, silent, patient, and full of poison. 3 men, masked and confident, crept toward Eli's barn just before dawn. They thought they'd catch him off guard, maybe scare him into leaving, or worse, make an example of him. But the land had changed since Keona's cries echoed through the snow. The trees watched now. The wind whispered warnings. And the Apache, though unseen, were never far. As the intruders stepped into the barn, ready to torch it, a single arrow landed at their feet, silent, precise, and enough to freeze the blood in any man's veins. Eli heard the scuffle from inside and reached for his old Winchester out of instinct. But by the time he swung the door open, the fight was already done. The attackers lay face down in the snow, alive but broken. Around them stood a ring of warriors, their eyes like flint, their presence like thunder about to break. One of them, a tall man named Taza, stepped forward and nodded at Eli, not seeking approval, not offering explanation, just a shared understanding. Loyalty runs deeper than fear. Eli lowered his rifle. He didn't need it anymore. That moment changed everything. Sheriff Holt heard what had happened and rode up the trail himself 2 days later. But this time he didn't come with threats. He came with questions. "They say 3 men disappeared near your barn," he muttered, avoiding Eli's gaze. "That true?" Eli didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed Holt a worn blanket, one of the ones he'd wrapped Kiona in the night he found her. "Sometimes," Eli said, "a man has to decide what kind of legacy he's leaving behind. I made mine." The sheriff looked at the blanket, then at the silent line of warriors behind Eli's cabin. He said no more. He turned his horse around and rode away. That winter, not a single coyote came near Eli's livestock. His cattle thrived. His crops, those he hadn't seen sprout in years, grew strong come spring. Townsfolk started sending their sick to him, asking for the herbs Sonny had left. Some even dropped off gifts at his porch, ashamed of their silence, but unsure how else to show it. Eli never turned anyone away, but he didn't smile much either. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just living a life the land had finally taught him how to live. A life of balance, of humility, of unseen strength. And still, every few weeks, Kiona would return with her family to visit. She was growing fast, her hair darker than night, her laugh quick like river water. She always ran straight to Eli, calling him so, the Apache word for rock. Not because he was cold, but because he was steady, reliable. She would sit on his knee as he told stories of his younger days, of horses and hills, of rivers that ran dry and hearts that found water again. And though she was just a child, she listened like someone who understood that some stories aren't just told. They're inherited, and hers had just begun. The day the government man came was dry and hot. One of those days where the dust hangs in the air like old secrets. He wore a clean black suit, too stiff for the West, and boots that had never met mud. He introduced himself as Mr. Jennings from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but he spoke with the kind of authority that didn't bother waiting for permission. "We've heard rumors," he said, standing on Eli's porch, "about a cowboy and child, about some arrangement that might be improper." Eli didn't flinch. He didn't invite the man inside either. Jennings wasn't alone. He had 2 soldiers with him, young and mean-eyed, holding rifles not out of need, but habit. They didn't care about Kiona or Eli's honor. They cared about control. "It's not proper for a native child to be involved with someone outside her blood," Jennings declared. "We're here to correct that." Eli didn't argue. He just pointed. Behind the government men, nearly 30 Apache warriors stood silently at the tree line, watching. Jennings turned pale. "You're harboring fugitives," he hissed. Eli finally spoke. "No," he said, voice calm as a canyon. "I'm living with neighbors." The standoff didn't end in bullets. It ended in silence. Jennings left, humiliated, swearing he'd return with reinforcements. But he never did. Rumor had it his superior heard about the standoff and quietly reassigned him to desk duty in Missouri. Word traveled differently out west. It wasn't about law. It was about reputation. And Eli Cutter now had the kind of name you didn't challenge unless you were ready to lose more than your pride. But Eli didn't wear that name with pride. He wore it like a scar, earned, heavy, and real. Spring bled into summer, and Eli's life settled into something that resembled peace. The barn was rebuilt, this time with carvings along the beams, symbols Sonny had taught him, meant to honor the land and its spirits. The creek behind the house never dried again, and the hawks that used to circle above as omens now flew with a stillness that felt like blessing. Eli had known many kinds of loneliness, but now he knew a different kind of quiet, one that didn't ache, one that felt whole. And still, at night, he kept a small pouch by his bed. Inside it was a strip of hide from the blanket Kiona had been found in, a wooden horse he'd carved for her first birthday, and a feather iron dog had once placed behind Eli's ear during a naming rite. These weren't trophies. They were reminders that in a world that had nearly broken him, one act of kindness had become a bridge between enemies, a fire against the cold, and a story that even the wind still carried. The stories about Eli began to spread beyond Dry Creek, beyond the hills, beyond the state line. Ranchers whispered his name, with a mixture of reverence and disbelief. Some said he had the power to speak with animals. Others claimed bullets refused to touch him. But the truth was simpler and far more powerful. Eli had become a symbol of something rare: unity. In a land built on division, he was proof that respect could grow in hostile soil. And yet, with every new tale, Eli grew quieter. Fame wasn't something he craved. He had learned that legends are often lonely. One summer evening, as the sun bled gold across the prairie, Eli received an unexpected visitor. It was an old enemy, Tommy Fay, a man whose cattle Eli had once rustled during his reckless youth. Tommy had every reason to hold a grudge, but age had softened the edges of old wounds. He came not with blame, but with a question. "How'd you change?" he asked, chewing a blade of grass like it held answers. Eli didn't respond right away. He simply nodded toward Kiona, who was helping Sonny tend to the garden, her laughter echoing in the wind. "You don't always choose your path," Eli said. "But sometimes you get a chance to choose what kind of man you are when the path finds you." That moment marked something unspoken between the two men. They shared a meal that night: beans, cornbread, and silence. Tommy left the next morning, but not before saying, "If you ever need help, Cutter, I'll come." That promise, simple as it was, meant more than gold. Because in the West, loyalty wasn't measured in words. It was measured in who showed up when the smoke rose. Eli didn't take the offer lightly. He added Tommy's name to the growing list of men he could trust, men he never expected to stand beside. But not all change was welcome. Iron Dog, old and proud, began to grow frail. His strength waned, and with it came whispers of who would take his place. Some in the tribe feared that the growing bond with Eli would die with the chief. Others saw a future in it. The tension was quiet but constant. Sonny stood between two worlds, daughter of a chief and friend to a cowboy. She urged unity, reminded her people of the night 300 warriors stood to guard a white man's home. But peace in the West is always one spark away from burning. Then, during a ceremony meant to honor the harvest moon, a boy from the tribe, young and impulsive, challenged Eli, not with weapons, but with words. "You are not one of us," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "You sheltered a child, but that does not make you blood." The circle went silent. Eli didn't rise, didn't fight. He simply looked at Kiona, who stepped forward, placed her hand in his, and said, "He is my blood." The old woman nodded. Iron Dog smiled, and the fire between them, once flickering, blazed anew. By the time autumn painted the land in copper and crimson, Eli's cabin had become more than a shelter. It was a place where stories were born. The porch creaked beneath the weight of shared laughter, and the chimney never went cold. Children from the tribe visited often, drawn not just to the warmth of the hearth, but to the quiet wisdom of the cowboy who had once lived as a shadow. Eli taught them how to track deer without leaving prints, how to read the clouds like an old journal, and how to carve animals from wood with hands steady as time. But in return, they taught him too, songs older than any border, dances that honored ancestors, and a language not spoken, but felt. One night, as frost began to edge the windows, Sonny came to Eli with a look that was both firm and fragile. "The elders want to name you," she said. "To make it formal." Eli blinked. "Name me." She nodded. "You've lived between our worlds long enough. It's time you stood inside one." Eli didn't speak. He wasn't sure he deserved such an honor. But when Kiona climbed onto his lap and whispered, "Say yes, so," he knew he couldn't say no. The ceremony was set for the next full moon. That night, men and women gathered in a ring of stone, surrounded by firelight and stars. Eli stood in the center, humbled in silence. Iron Dog, thin but standing strong, lifted a carved staff. In Apache tongue, he spoke of courage, of mercy, of what it meant to protect the innocent even when the cost was high. Then he placed his weathered hand on Eli's shoulder and said the name, Goyaklisa, he who listens to the wind. A name not given lightly. Eli bowed his head. He didn't need applause. The echo of the name was enough. After the ceremony, as embers faded and stars deepened, Sonny handed Eli a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a cloak, dyed deep red, embroidered with the same symbol that now hung above his doorway, 2 hands holding a flame. You belong here, she said. Not because of what you did, but because of who you've become. Eli nodded, unable to speak. He folded the cloak with care, placed it beside the pouch by his bed, and for the first time in years, allowed a tear to fall. In the weeks that followed, life moved like a steady river. The peace held. The tribe thrived. The town, though wary, stayed quiet. And Eli Cutter, once a forgotten rider in the snow, now stood at the crossroads of two histories. One written in ink and loss, the other carved in stone and memory. But both, finally, flowing in the same direction. Winter returned, as it always did in those parts, but this time, it felt different. The cold no longer pressed into Eli's bones like regret. There was warmth now, within the walls of his cabin, yes, but also in the air between people. Kiona spent most evenings by his side, asking endless questions about cattle, horses, and the stars. Eli answered them all, but each response was less about knowledge and more about presence. He had once believed his purpose had ended with loss. Now he saw it had only just begun the moment he stepped off that saddle to pick up a crying child in the snow. But nature, wild and untamed, doesn't rest just because hearts have healed. In late January, a sickness began to sweep through the valley. At first, it was just a cough, then fever, then silence. Two elders from the tribe passed within days of each other. Panic started to ripple. The doctor for Dry Creek refused to ride up the mountain, fearing infection. Not worth the risk, he said. They've got their own ways. But those ways weren't working fast enough. It was Sonny who came to Eli one night, her face pale, her voice tight with fear. She's burning, she said. Eli didn't need to ask who. He found Kiona trembling in her bed, her skin hot like the embers he used to stoke in winter. Her breath was shallow, her cheeks flushed deep red. Eli's hands, once so sure around tools and rifles, now trembled with helplessness. But he didn't let fear win. He boiled herbs, poured cold water into cloths, and sat by her side without sleep for 2 days straight. He whispered stories in her ears, the kind that held magic between the lines, about horses that ran faster than thunder, and coyotes that sang to the moon because they missed someone they loved. He sang the lullabies Sonny taught him, though his voice cracked like dry wood. On the third morning, as frost laced the window pane, Kiona opened her eyes. Weak but clear, she reached for Eli's hand, and he held it like it was the last rope keeping him anchored to the earth. The sickness would fade, the medicine would do its part, but everyone knew what had truly kept her tethered. Not potions, not prayers, but love. The kind that doesn't care about blood or borders. The kind that shows up when all else has fallen away. When the tribe gathered that night and saw her smiling again, they didn't celebrate with noise. They simply looked at Eli with a reverence few men ever earn. Iron Dog, watching from the shadows of his final winter, called Eli over by firelight. You saved her again, he said, voice like wind through brittle leaves. Eli shook his head. I just stayed, he whispered. Iron Dog smiled. Then you've understood more than most ever do. That night, the old chief passed, as quietly as he had lived, his final breath carried west by a wind that smelled faintly of sage and smoke. And though his body was buried the next morning beneath the mountain cedar, everyone knew the true legacy he left behind was still standing, tall, quiet, and holding a little girl's hand. With Iron Dog gone, a new chapter began, tense, uncertain, and watched carefully by all. The council elders met beneath the sacred tree to decide who would lead the tribe into the seasons ahead. There were those who believed Sonny should step into her father's place, and many supported her. But not everyone welcomed the idea of a woman bridging both worlds. Some saw her bond with Eli as dangerous, a sign of weakness, or worse, betrayal. Old wounds were hard to close, even harder to forget. And in the silence that followed Iron Dog's passing, old ghosts found room to whisper. Sonny didn't back down. She stood before the council with the calm fire of someone who had nothing left to prove. My father didn't fear bridges, she said. He built them. She spoke of the night Eli found Kiona, of the warriors who stood as sentinels in the snow, of the lives saved when men chose mercy over violence. Her voice never trembled. Her words weren't loud, but they echoed. When she finished, she didn't ask for votes. She simply stepped back and waited. And after a long pause, one elder rose. then another, and another, until every voice in the circle spoke her name. She had not just earned leadership. She had become it. Eli watched from the edge of the gathering, neither apart nor fully within. He had no title, no blood claim. But when Sani approached him afterward, she placed something in his hand, a single black stone, polished and warm. "Keep this," she said. "So, you remember you helped build this too." He nodded, unsure what to say. The stone was heavy for its size, not because of its weight, but because of its meaning. It wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol that sometimes the quietest man can shape the loudest future. Meanwhile, in Dry Creek, not all had forgotten the old ways. Rumors spread again, about how the tribe was gaining strength, about how the line between white and native was blurring too much. Men who'd stayed silent for years began holding meetings, whispering in saloons, gripping rifles a little tighter when they rode past the hills. Sheriff Holt, older now and weary, tried to calm the fires. "Let them be," he told his deputies. "Peace is harder to build than war is to start." But some weren't looking for peace. They were looking for an excuse. And so, one evening as dusk fell like a curtain, a shot rang out in the distance, sharp, clean, unmistakable. It didn't hit anyone. It didn't even strike close. But it echoed through the valley like a challenge. When Eli heard it, he didn't run. He simply stood, turned toward the sound, and waited. Because he knew that while the snow might melt, and the rivers might swell, some stories aren't done until they face fire one last time. The shot came from a ridge just beyond the northern trees, land considered neutral, but watched carefully by both sides. By morning, tracks were found. Boot prints, not moccasins. Deep, staggered, and rushed. Whoever fired the rifle wasn't trying to kill. They were sending a message, and Eli had received it. That night, he rode into town for the first time in over a year. The saloon went quiet when he pushed through the door. His presence was like a storm rolling in, silent, cold, full of warning. He didn't speak to the barkeep. He didn't look for company. He went straight to Sheriff Holt. "I need to know who's stirring the dust," Eli said. Holt looked tired, older somehow. "You already know," he muttered. "But knowing and proving are two different things." Eli nodded. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to be seen. Let them talk. Let them feel the weight of what they were poking at. By the time Eli left the saloon, the message had been returned. If they wanted to dig up the past, they'd better be ready to face the future he represented. And that future was no longer just a man. It was a community, a tribe, a bond that had already survived winter and fire. Still, Eli knew peace couldn't be held by silence alone. He returned to the tribe and met with Sani, Taza, and the rest of the council. "They won't stop with warnings," he said. "They're looking for weakness, and if they find it, they'll come." Sani agreed. Preparations began, not for war, but for protection. Scouts were posted along the ridges. Elders moved children to higher ground, where the forest could hide them better. Fires were kept low, voices quieter. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. They had all come too far to be dragged back into the darkness. One night, as snow returned like an old ghost, Kiona climbed onto the roof of the cabin where Eli sat watching the valley. She wrapped a blanket around both of them and rested her head on his shoulder. "Are they coming for me?" she asked. Eli paused. "No," he said firmly. "They're coming for what we represent." She looked up at him with eyes full of understanding beyond her years. "Then we don't hide," she whispered. Eli smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "We don't." And under that pale moonlight, a child and a cowboy watched the horizon together, knowing the storm would come, but also knowing they wouldn't face it alone. The next morning brought something unexpected. A rider. Alone. Waving a white cloth. It was Tommy Fay. "They're planning something," he said without dismounting. "A raid. Maybe 2 nights from now. They're calling it justice, but it's nothing but fear wrapped in lies." Eli listened, his face unreadable. Tommy leaned forward, lowering his voice. "They think you'll break if they push hard enough. But they don't know. You already broke once. And you didn't stay broken." Eli nodded slowly. Then, looking over the treetops toward where the mountains kissed the clouds, he said, "Let them come. We'll be ready." And this time it wasn't defiance. It was truth. 2 nights later, the wind howled through the canyons like it remembered blood. The trees swayed like watchers unsure whether to flee or fight. And in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the valley, lanterns flickered, too many to count, all moving slow and steady. The raiders had come. They brought torches, rifles, and the certainty of men who thought they were the only ones armed with righteousness. But what they didn't understand, what they never truly grasped, was that courage doesn't come from numbers. It comes from memory, from love, from a history born in snow and sealed in silence. Eli stood at the gate of his ranch, rifle slung, but not raised. Beside him stood Sonny, Taza, and nearly 50 others, warriors, elders, even children holding rocks in small fists. Behind them, more waited, hidden, ready, not for vengeance, for protection. The raiders paused when they saw the wall of people, a wall made of blood and bond. One man, broad-shouldered, drunk with arrogance, stepped forward. "We ain't here to kill," he shouted. "We're here to reclaim what's ours." Eli stepped forward too, voice calm but firm. "You lost the right to claim anything the moment you forgot what it meant to be human." A single shot fired. No one knows who pulled the trigger. It missed, high and wide, but it broke the night like a curse. Chaos threatened to erupt. But before the next shot could come, the earth roared. From the hills, from the trees, from the riverbanks, came a chorus of war cries. Not from the tribe, but from their allies. Ranchers, former soldiers, even Tommy Fay, holding a shotgun with trembling hands but fire in his eyes. The raiders didn't expect that. They didn't expect Dry Creek to split down the middle and choose both sides. Some dropped weapons. Others ran. The rest were surrounded, and not a single drop of blood was spilled. When the dust settled, Eli walked among the raiders, not with rage, but with resolve. "You came here to burn," he said, "but you only lit the fire under your own feet." Sheriff Holt arrived hours later. He took one look at the scene, holstered his weapon, and said only 3 words, "It's over now." The town never spoke of the raid in detail again, but they remembered, not because of the violence that didn't happen, but because of the courage that did. And in that quiet victory, something deeper was forged. In the days that followed, fences were rebuilt, not to divide, but to protect. The town slowly began to send letters, supplies, even apologies. A schoolhouse was built where children of both bloodlines learned to write their names beside each other. And Eli, he went back to tending his land, carving wooden horses, and watching the stars. Kiona grew taller, her laughter still ringing through the cabin like church bells. And though no one could erase the past, everyone now knew what the future could hold. Not perfect peace, but earned respect. Not silence, but harmony. And every winter, when the snow began to fall, Kiona would wrap herself in that red cloak stitched with fire and hands. She'd ask Eli to tell the story again, the one that started with a baby in the snow. And Eli, with a voice made warm by memory, would begin the tale the same way every time. There was a night, long ago, when a cowboy chose not to ride away. In the vastness of the West, where silence speaks louder than words and the land itself holds memory in its bones, Eli Cutter became something more than a man. He became a bridge between worlds that were never meant to touch, let alone walk side by side. His story was not one of glory or conquest, but of quiet choices, each one made in the face of loneliness, fear, and the heavy weight of the unknown. And through those choices, he rewrote what it meant to be strong. Not with fists, but with compassion. Not with control, but with courage. What began with a single cry in the snow became a movement of hearts. The simple act of picking up a child transformed a forgotten cowboy into a guardian of something greater than land or tradition. It made him a keeper of unity. Through winter and fire, through sickness and gunpowder, Eli stood not for himself, but for the life he had chosen to protect. And that life, that little girl with a warrior's soul, became the light that warmed even the coldest corners of his past. Together, they didn't just survive, they built something worth remembering. We often believe that history is shaped by the loud, the powerful, the relentless. But this tale reminds us that sometimes the most profound changes come from the silent actions of those who are willing to listen. Eli didn't speak much. He didn't argue, but he lived in a way that made others pause, question, and eventually follow. He proved that legacy isn't built by bloodlines. It's built by the choices we make when no one's watching, and by how fiercely we stand for those who have no voice. So if you carry anything from this story, let it be this. When the world draws lines, be the one who builds a bridge. When fear knocks, answer with empathy. And when fate offers you a moment to act with grace, take it, because it might be the very moment history has been waiting for. Eli Cutter never set out to change the West, but by choosing love over fear and protection over pride, he became the kind of legend that doesn't need songs or statues, just memory. If this story moved you the way it was meant to, consider becoming part of this journey. Subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable tales like this one. Leave a comment with what part of Eli's journey struck you the most. And don't forget to like the video, because every voice helps these stories echo a little farther across the plains.